All right. Good morning, everyone. Brian with City of the Immaculata here, back with you. Hello to friends and family and loved ones, foes alike. Sorry, it's been a little while, guys. I've had a little bit going on. So whenever I've got things going on, this always has to take a back seat as it's just sort of a fun project for me. But back with you here today. I've been thinking about this project for a while now and trying to figure out how I wanted to approach the subject. For those of you that are a little bit familiar with this channel, you'll know that I kind of stick, for the most part, to medieval Catholic topics, though I do like to throw in some of this period that's of interest to me, that's been of interest to me for a long time, specifically world history, roughly from like the 1920s. Well, teens. I guess you could say the turn of the 20th century up until about World War II. Now, unfortunately for me, the brunt of my studies was spent in the subject of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which I could tell you quite a bit about. That's a little bit of a fool's errand, though, because I don't particularly think that Marxism is the like big threat of the world today as it once was in the early 20th century. Super fascinating history. You'd have to really begin with you'd really actually with Russia, you'd have to begin about 1905 with the 1905 revolution, because you don't get the 1917 revolution without the 1905 revolution. But that's its own little like box of history. Really what I want to do is present things on this channel that are a little bit more relevant, especially to the world today and the kind of world that Catholics might be trying to navigate through and make sense of. So I've had in my mind this presentation of like early 20th century Americana, and then some of the actual like nightmarish beliefs that were making the rounds of this period of time that really ended up permeating into the culture that we live in today, because so much of this like dialogue that we have today is against like progressive modernity against traditionalism, where I think traditionalism sort of makes the mistake of getting really lost and hazy in what exactly we're trying to preserve. This is becoming more and more apparent, I think, within the conservative movement, that it's a challenge to kind of come to some kind of consensus or agreement of what conservatism like is, what we're trying to conserve. So these like tales that we have like failed to tell about some of the dark past that we have, I think it's important to kind of bring some of this stuff to the limelight. The challenge is that there are so many different avenues that I could take for a subject like this, and like picking where to start, like what to go after. I don't think there's necessarily like helpful to begin in like chronological order, because it's not absolutely necessary for the telling of what's happened and why these things have led to where we are today. So two ideas that I have planned in mind to begin to sort of like help this narrative get out there, and I'm sure it's going to go to other places over time, but two very important like demarcations of events, paradigms, or like mythical Americana is: one, I want to begin here today with what's known as the Scopes monkey trial. And then two, I'm going to follow up in the next couple of weeks with the eugenics movement in the USA. These are two things that are kind of born out of a common incestuous ideologies, and they come about really about the same time, not unrelated. One being an event, of course, and the other being a movement. But the goals in this are kind of like multivariate in my mind. As I said, some of this has permeated our culture. Without the historical backdrop being given, it sort of allowed people to present a narrative that's destitute of anything that's actually authentic. So while much of the, quote, ethical secularists claim today for themselves, much of what they say is their own was born out of actually these really horrendous ideologies that they today absolutely refuse to take accountability for, while at the same time, like finger wagging at us. They're quick to blame religious people. Here, I mean principally Christians, be they Protestant or Catholic in this case, who were by and large the sort of bulwark against this predecessing this the predecessors of modern day secularism. It was the Christians who stopped, or at least presented, the greatest challenge from progressives unleashing on the world programs that were explicitly designed to eliminate certain classes of people. It almost wouldn't bother me if they just wanted to kind of brush their own history under the rug and make us all forget. But people, while people have done that down throughout history and throughout the ages, what they're doing today is, while they're trying to brush their own history under the rug, they're simultaneously denigrating ours, when ours, in fact, is more often than not the one that comes out objectively on the right side of history. In my eyes, anyways, it fully vindicates us for going after secularism today on some of the like absurd claims that they make, and going after them hard, because we do have a firm foundation historically, objectively, to go after secularism. And I want to see others actually take this up. I'm a small fry, right? This is a small channel, insignificant in the broader scope of things. But if I can help in some way kind of get this info out there to really persuade, hopefully, some of you to take these subjects up. I'm telling you, there's so much in this history, the early 20th century, that vindicates us. And that absolutely demolishes, at the very least, absolutely demolishes the secularist moral high ground. You would be amazed as you go through it just how awful secularism was within this entire like paradigm of things like the eugenics movement. Now, for today's subject, I'm actually going to start much later than the event itself, 25 years late, in fact. As bad as the history of the telling of the Scopes trial is, it's not without reason that it's told as bad as it is. Besides the initial coverage of it back in 1925, a quarter century after the event took place, there was a very popular film entitled Inherit the Wind. Came out in 1960, which has much shaped the public image of this trial. Now, Inherit the Wind was based on a 1955 play, very popular play, but it was this version, this film version, starring Spencer Tracy and Gene Kelly, that is really the impetus for why we remember the trial 100 years later. And an interesting little tidbit about the play itself: it was written by two men who were, in the 1950s, put under the scrutiny of the McCarthy hearings. For those of you that aren't aware, Senator McCarthy started this something of like a crusade against what he saw. Well, okay, so you have in the 19 teens, right? 1917, you have the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, when the Bolsheviks come to power, the interesting thing about the Russian Revolution was that it was never supposed to be, according to scientific Marxism, Russia was never supposed to be the place where the Marxist revolution actually took place. It was supposed to be Germany, a highly industrialized country like Germany. Russia was like very much seen as way too agricultural, still coming out of the feudal time, not within late stage capitalism of scientific Marxism. So Lenin, and in fact, Lenin himself, he had to early in his writings before the Bolshevik Revolution. If you see much of Lenin's early writings, he's writing about, like for example, it's a propagandist work. It's called The Development of Capitalism in Russia. He's trying to make the like absurd case that Russia was actually, despite all the appearances, was late stage capitalism. So therefore, we could have a revolutionary movement. We could justify a Marxist movement within Russia. So, anyways, the whole purpose of scientific Marxism was that it was going to be a worldwide movement. That's why after the Bolsheviks take power, there's this argument going back and forth about how to handle the worldwide Comintern, the Communist International Movement. But one thing they all agreed on was that it was going to be international. It was going to be a worldwide revolution. So in the 1920s in the USA, there was a justified panic called the Red Scare. And the Red Scare, the 1920s, is sort of its own thing. But you fast forward and you have the Stalin-Trotsky dispute that kind of takes place. And then within the U.S., there's this, after World War II and after the Russians successfully march into Berlin, there's this worldwide, as we know, the Cold War, right? And the 1950s, as you can imagine, is this paradigm of the Cold War, West versus East. Who's gonna win this so-called Cold War? So there was this fear that there was communist infiltration in the 1950s, which actually turns out later, according to the Venona papers, to have been justified. But one of the senators that took this hearing up, and he was a very flawed man, undoubtedly, and the whole campaign was kind of flawed. But at a base root foundational level, it was justified because McCarthy went after certain Hollywood writers who were, as we would come to find later, were actually communist sympathizers, and they were writing these stories, these propagandist subliminal stories that were filtering out into the American movie industry, right? So anyways, two of the men who were on McCarthy's list, the blacklist as it became known, were the two writers who wrote this play, Inherit the Wind. And the entire play is supposed to be seen as an allegory of what McCarthy was doing, set in the incident of the 1925 Scopes monkey trial. Right. So here you have these two poor commies, would-be mass murderers, right? Let's not lose like perspective of what the stakes were with Marxist revolution, right? They want to put out this little piece of propaganda that illustrates why bigotry shouldn't be tolerated, leaving aside the fact that the communists themselves would be the first to round up and eliminate dissidents. But never mind the inconsistencies there, right? For this to like tell their story, they use as an allegory what's known as the Scopes monkey trial. And of course, what they did in reality was absolutely obliterate the facts to serve their purpose. The message that they wanted to get to Middle America in 1955 is that you are intolerant zealots, and come here, pay to see this play, pay to see this movie so that you can hear all about it. So in preparation for this, I actually went back and rewatched the 1960 movie. It's been some years since I had seen it, many years, in fact. And I remember thinking years ago as a young, maybe a teenager, whenever I watched it, it's like, wow, what a powerful film that was. On rewatching it, I don't even mean as like a skeptical observer now that I may be as an adult, right, with a little bit more formed opinions, but the reality is that it's such blatantly bad propaganda that it's almost embarrassing that anyone ever bought into this. I feel like it wouldn't be unjust to call it boomer tier propaganda for some of you Gen Z people out there, to use your terminology. It's like boomer tier propaganda, given the fact that I think today it's a little bit harder and people have to be a little bit more manipulative to be successfully propagandized. But Admittedly, though, with this film, the acting, the music, the general feel of it's got a really nice black and white um color, what's the word I'm using for? I'm not a major film aficionado, contrast or whatever it is, but the film is well produced, all right? And this has always been one of the challenges of the arts, right? Going all the way back to Plato and his opinions of poetry and the arts, is that really good art can be quite subversive and effective, especially against people that are not well formed. And film is just a good example of this. And it's so obviously, it's been for the last 100 years, so obviously slanted, that it just amazes me that people watching it fall for the stuff that they do. But when it's sort of subcontextualized within these well produced, well acted films, it's you can kind of see where this stuff seeps into the culture. So the setup here for this movie, and I loosely recommend watching Inherit the Wind so you can see what I'm getting at, but at the same time, there's going to be spoilers here. So just be wary of that, right? If you know the history anyways, it's like hard to do a spoiler alert on something that you're familiar with the history. But just to give you that warning. But it begins, Inherit the Wind, 1960, Spencer Tracy version, with this rebellious teacher who's daring to teach his eager students about evolution. And as he does this, the authorities come in and arrest him. There's a local politician in this little town who also happens to be a demagogic fundamentalist named Brady, and he takes on the prosecution of this teacher. He's popular in this little backwoods religious hick town in the South that is complete with its own like zealot preacher and in the collar. And then there's a reporter named Hornbeck from Baltimore who's supposed to be this like witty and hard hitting, as well as an agnostic defense attorney arrives named Drummond. And so these are your main characters for the film: the teacher, prosecutor, defense lawyer, Baltimore reporter. And as you can guess, 60 some years removed from this film, it's cliche, but at the same time, it was like considered pioneering and progressive at the time. But the religious attorney ends up coming off as a sort of prehistoric, unscientific kind of country bumpkin, while the agnostic is this calm, rational lawyer, and he wins the day for the advancement of truth and science. And of course, all of the young teen kids just like love him, and they see him as this like hip, cool, like swell kind of guy, right? Now, I can imagine many of you, if you know of the Scopes Monkey trial, or your parents, or especially your grandparents, even more so, this was the narrative that you've been given and that they've been given. It's that, oh, yeah, there was these religious fanatics that tried to keep the truth from being taught in the classroom. If they remember anything about it at all, that's what your grandparents, I'm sure, remembered. And as you could guess, historic reality throw all of that out the window. It's utter trash. So let's go all the way back to the beginning, shall we? In the first, there was no situation where law enforcement came barging into a classroom in real time. What actually happened was much, much more contrived than that. Unlike the fictitious town of Hillsboro, which Inherit the Wind is set in, the real events take place in Dayton, Tennessee. Now, in the years leading up to 1925, the town of Dayton had experienced a major population decline. At the same time, the Tennessee legislature had just passed these laws that had outlawed the teaching of evolution in classrooms. Now, the reason for this is actually quite dense and not as simple as just some dumb hicks in Tennessee with their Bibles, and they just want to get rid of that evolution. There was a debate taking place, which is actually very relevant to the world we live in today. whether or not the states should be responsible for education. People saw rightly that the consequences of that means that the state itself would dictate the curriculums with which may or may not line up with one's personal beliefs or ethics. So the state, if the state is in control of education, that means the state is in control of the curriculum. That means that the state is in control basically of how to propagandize your child. So in an attempt to thwart this, the Butler Act was passed in Tennessee, which stated that it was now against the law to teach any theory that, quote, denies the story of divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals, end quote. Now, certain legal theorists say that this was simply an attempt to keep man unique among the creatures, and that teachers could say that other animals were not allowed to say that there was descent with modification per Darwinism, right? Regardless if that be true or not, the key is that the people's concern was over state control of education, which was all the rage at the time in the country. It's its own subject, it's its own story. But as the federal and state governments in the early 20th century expanded their authority in an ever widening net, this was one of the concerns that people had. And I think here, 100 years later, the people were rightly, no matter what you think about the argument about creation versus evolution, the people were rightly, I think, justified in their hesitancy and their concerns about the state taking over education. So when this law was passed, when the Butler Act was passed, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, expressed that they would fund any teacher that violated the law. So you have some city officials in Dayton, Tennessee, where the demographic population has been declining, keen to get their city placed on the map again to bring in some business, conspired with a local named John Scopes. John Scopes was a football coach who occasionally acted as a substitute teacher when needed. Scopes agreed with the with the city officials that he would say that he had taught from a certain book called Civic Biology, though he in fact never had. He even went and coached his students to perjure themselves by saying that he had been teaching from this book. Now, right here, I want to pause for a moment because this book, Civic Biology, gets left out of the discussion a lot. Like every time this topic is discussed, it's just, oh, this was all about mind control and these religious bigots keeping people from thinking freely. That's the narrative, right? Well, let's see what they were thinking freely about. Civics Biology, written in 1914 by an ACLU member and teacher named George W. Hunter. It was the standard biology textbook issued by states at the time in the 1920s. Hunter himself was an avid, so keep that in mind, right? That goes back to the first thing we mentioned, right? States taking control of education. This was the standard civic biology textbook issued by states. Hunter himself was an avid supporter of eugenics and racial and class segregation, which places the story square in the center of a wider discussion that we're going to be having on this channel about this period of time. By 1925, we are 60 years removed from Darwin's Origin of Species. Though itself a book really limited in its scope to the study of variations among species, emerging from his ideas came a movement dedicated to societal cleansing by application of a type of artificial selecting for human society. And we're going to get into this in greater detail in a future video, but just now realize that in the 1920s, the social Darwinian idea and the eugenics movement had major backing and support by very wealthy private as well as public funding. Hence the fact that the state was issuing this textbook for teens in high school. So what are some of the things that we find in this book? As An impressionable 13, 14-year-old in 1920 in the state-run school, you would have heard that, quote, from Civics Biology, page 261, when people marry, there are certain things that individual as well as the race should demand. The most important of these is freedom from germ diseases, which might be handed down to the offspring. Tuberculosis, that dread white plague which is still responsible for almost 1/7 of all deaths, epilepsy, and feeble-mindedness, are handicaps which it is not only unfair but criminal to hand down to posterity. The science of being well born is called the science of eugenics. Next, from page 261 to 263. Quote, studies have been made on a number of different families in this country in which mental and moral defects were present in one or both of the original parents. The Jukes family is a notorious example. In 75 years of progeny of the original generation, it has cost the state of New York over $1.25 million. If such people were lower animals, we would probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. Humanity will not allow this. We do have the remedy of separating the sexes in asylums or other places, and in various ways preventing intermarriage and the possibilities of perpetuating such a low and degenerate race. End quote. Next, quote, hundreds of families such as those described above today, spreading disease, immorality, and crime to all parts of this country. The cost of society of such families is very severe. Just as certain animals and plants become parasitic on other plants or animals, these people have become parasitic on society. They not only do harm to others by corrupting, stealing, spreading disease, but they are actually protected and cared for by the state out of public money. Largely for them, the poorhouse and the asylum exist. They take from society, but they give nothing in turn. They are true parasites. End quote. He goes on to rank races into 5 categories, from the inferior races to the superior, with whites being on top, of course, and claiming that all of this is backed up by science, none other than Darwinian science itself. So this is the book we're talking about here. Perfectly innocent and fitting for teens, right? And they're just teaching science, right? That's all. We're just trying to get the truth of science out there. Never mind the fact that it's wrong. Like this paradigm of, oh, we just want to teach the science. That's all we're interested in, is teaching the science. The fact that the science is wrong and you could produce a generation of morally degenerate, murderous, monstrous people, you have to wonder, where did some of the atrocities of the early 20th century come from? Well, and now here you have those backwoods religionists, these backwood hicks. They're trying to stand in the way of this progress. Onwards, comrades. We have to get rid of these religionists. Now, as I stated, Scopes himself had never actually taught evolution, never actually taught from the book. Not that he can remember, anyways, to quote from him. So along with the students, he's going to perjure himself in this process. He self-incriminates himself just to get the lawsuit filed and a trial arranged. And the trial is the state of Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes. And from day one, the entire thing is an absolute farce. Now, the chief player of the defense was a man named Clarence Darrow. I just said above, the character that Spencer Tracy plays in Inherit the Wind. They changed the names in Inherit the Wind. It's not a one, but the characters are based on these. The characters in the film are based on these true characters. So the one that Spencer Tracy plays is based on the defense lawyer Clarence Darrow. Clarence was a ACLU man. He had actually debated G.K. Chesterton once in a debate. By the accounts, all that were in attendance, he actually lost the debate to Chesterton. He was himself an agnostic and a eugenicist who told the Washington Times that we should, quote, chloroform unfit children, show them the same mercy that is shown to beasts that are no longer fit to live, end quote. Yet at the same time, he was the public critic of the eugenics movement as a whole. But still, this is the guy that today when this Scopes monkey trial is told. This is their hero, Clarence Darrow, who said that unfit children should be slaughtered. More interesting than him, though, is the chief prosecutor, William Jennings Bryan. And Bryan's is a really interesting, and because of this trial, a much maligned man. Now, personally, I'm not here to like vindicate either man, as I think they both have their problems. But all things considered, William Jennings Bryan was undoubtedly the more Christian, dare I say, more humane actor in this entire event. And he's certainly the best illustration of how complex these like oversimplified stereotypes of events and people really are. Once you get past the secular propaganda of how this stuff is passed down, you can kind of come to see the real complexities of all of this. Because in many ways, he represents a sort of sacrificial victim of the American leftist ideology. And this is something that the left has always had a problem with, where you're never safe on the left. you know, Leaving aside the fact that their left is known for these like these purity spirals where you try to out pure left, whatever the ideology is, it spirals into this thing where they devour each other. You also have the situation where if an event comes along that the left wants to take advantage of, right? Never let a crisis go to waste. If an event comes along that the left wants to take an advantage of, and let's just say you've been a champion for their causes all the way up to that point, if you don't follow them exactly on this event that arises, that takes place, you will be sacrificed at the altar. And it's a testament to the fruit that identity politics bears, that they will absolutely devour their own if a crisis arises that allows them, that this a person might be hindering their chances to exploit, no matter how much they dedicated their lives to the cause, to the progressive cause. Any and all run the risk of being slain, and such was the case of William Jennings Bryan, because here was a man who had dedicated his entire life actually to progressive causes. Admirably, he was a man who championed labor regulations. He pioneered and passed reforms for workers when he was involved in federal politics. He was a congressman. He ran on the Democratic Party ticket in the 1896 presidential election that he lost to McKinley. He was Secretary of State for Woodrow Wilson. He was later a crusader for the progressive prohibition movement. So, in other words, this was a man, he was a darling of late 19th, early 20th century progressive left. But he had one fault as far as leftist history is concerned. He was an anti evolutionist Presbyterian. And as some of you are aware, the 19th century Protestant crisis was between this burgeoning liberal theology that wanted to sort of undercut the supernatural elements of religion while maintaining the humanitarian aspects of Christianity. On the other side, as a reaction to that, you get this, what becomes known as the fundamentalist theology. Well, for all of his contributions to the progressive causes, William Jennings Bryan's commitment to his religious convictions would be his downfall as far as the secular left is concerned. Now, the final player in this drama, played by Gene Kelly of all people in Inherit the Wind, I think that's about the most miscast person for this in that movie, is none other than that the Baltimorean curmudgeon journalist H.L. Mencken. Now, what to say about H.L. Mencken? I have a little bit of a complicated history with him. So, as a teen, I've always been super fascinated by men that challenge the status quo, all right? And especially when they're sort of like witty, controversial kind of figures and just interesting characters. Well, as a teen, I remember in high school there was a school assignment to read Richard Wright's story called Black Boy. And in this story, as a young man, Richard Wright, he was a young black boy in the South. He was not supposed to be educated, but he learns how to read, and he wants to go to the library. It's very difficult for a young African American to go to a library because he learns about this notorious character named H.L. Mencken. And Richard Wright just said he had, like, once he learned that all of the other, like, especially the white segregationists were like, you're not allowed to read Mencken. He's off limits. That kind of like sparked this interest in Wright where he wanted to go find him. And it's like, it's kind of a funny story in the book. It's been years since I read it, but I remember he's a young boy. He goes to the library. He finds Mencken's series of essays and he goes to check it out. And the librarian like looks up at him and is like, looks back down at the book. And I think there was like a little bit of a, he ends up getting the book, but there was a problem with him. So anyways, I'm reading that and I'm like, okay, who's this Mencken character? Right? Like that piqued my interest as well. So I go, gosh, I think it was actually a few years after that, because this is back in the day before the internet was a big thing. The internet was around, it was just not that useful at the time. I run across Mencken's Prejudices, a series of his essays, and I read him. And he did actually have a bit of an influence on me. He was a visceral, witty, sarcastic, snide writer, right? I saw him as just kind of this like fun rabble rouser that appealed to the sometimes like anarchic nature that you find in young men, right? But as an adult, when you really begin to sort of process Mencken's thought, it's pretty consistent with the progressive trends of the time. No matter how much he would want to distance himself from the establishment and be seen as like this grand critiquer of society, Mencken himself was a Darwinist, thoroughly convinced of the superiority of not just certain races, but certain ethnic groups. You know, he was German by descent, and part of the thrill of his lambasting the underbelly of American ethos, which he was so controversial for, excuse me, is that he was at times cutting right through Americans' very Anglo heritage in his critiques. So into the mix of all of this, though he was later, changed his mind on some of these things when America entered World War II and Germans became the brunt of propagandistic ridicule. And it's funny how those things work. When you're on the receiving end, you sometimes change your mind. But at that point, he was like, "Whoa, hold up, guys!" Right? But in 1925, at Scopes, he was the voice of the secular atheist Darwinists, who, of course, at the heart of all of this, wanted to push into young men and women's minds the ideology of evolutionary hygiene and ridding the world of the unwanteds. So Mencken came to Dayton to cover the trial, and he used all the power of his rhetorical skills, which, again, admittedly, he was very, very talented. All you have to do is go back and read, like, Prejudices to see this, right? But anyways, here he basically bends, he manipulates, and forms the American public's impression of what would have otherwise been just a little trial in some backwater town that no one heard of. Because as he's reporting back to the Baltimore Herald, I guess it would have been. I can't remember whoever he wrote for, but then that got published nationwide, right? So he's like getting the story out. This is how people would have, this is really, I guess 1920s would have been very early radio, but you're still dealing mostly with the print, right? Printing press, and that's how information would have been traveling. But the ACLU and the city of the city of Dayton, are looking to capitalize on this. They call in Mencken to cover it, and he, being the astute man that he was, knew that this was a beautiful chance to lambast the religious bumpkins of the South, as he liked to call them. And no matter how exemplary his track record of progressive causes were, up to that point, William Jennings Bryan becomes the icon, the target for all that was backwards and idiotic about Southern fundamentalists. Mencken truly did shape the narrative going forward for the secular paradigm of this. Now, Bryan, as a prosecuting lawyer, infamously drops the ball during the trial. Worst of all, when he allowed himself, prosecution lawyer, to take the witness stand and be cross-examined by Darrow on the science of the Bible, which absolutely had nothing to do with the trial itself. Now, while I'm sure, Bryan was probably a pious believer, he was not equipped to defend sacred scripture scientifically, and Darrow just eviscerated him. It's the grand finale. It's the third act of Inherit the Wind, William Jennings Bryan like making a fool of himself on the stand. All of this should tell you that this whole event really is just a farce. It's a real legitimate on the books trial with precedents in the United States court system, but no one was really concerned about the actual legal trial itself. The only thing that mattered was the narrative. We know that Scopes self-incriminated. Sure, Mr. ACLU lawyer. As far as I recollect, maybe I did teach from that there civics book. Okay. More than likely, the football coach, who was only occasionally acting as a substitute teacher, had never even opened the book itself. The kids in his class said they hadn't even seen it taught. In the end, judicially, he's given a small fine, and that's it. It's nothing like Inherit the Wind, where he's locked in jail, and he's awaiting this oh so important verdict, and there's so much riding on it. He got slapped on the wrist with a fine. None of that really matters. There were really three agendas on the map here that they got. One, challenge the parents who wanted to keep control over what their children's curriculum was in the schools. That's what brought the ACLU's interest there in the first place. Two, to bring attention to Dayton as their population was hemorrhaging. And three, for Mencken to cover the moronic Christians who live in the South and paint them in the worst light nationally that he could. And they got all three of these, at least up until really to today, right? Especially that last one, right? The South and the Christians and the Christian movements and the eugenics movement, of which this was riding along with on the coattails of, and it's sort of the undercurrent of the whole thing, saw this as a public victory for themselves as well. Next time on this, I'm hoping to have it ready by next week, guys. Just bear with me, but I'm going to be covering the eugenics movement as it relates to the contraceptive movement and how those two bedfellows were wed to one another. But the whole intention of this project here is to take the narrative back. And again, guys, I'm a small fish in a large pond. I want you guys to get out there and to sort of feel, do your research, study, make sure you're firm in the research that you've done on this stuff. But the message is clearly a win for us. This simplified tale of religion versus science, and that the science has all the ethical weight and veracity that Christianity has, well, that may be theoretically true had not the 20th century ever happened. All right. If we're talking about, all right, let's have some empirical evidence to show for some of this, the secularists don't have a good case to make because of the 20th century itself and some of the fruits of their ideology. They are the pushers of some of the worst theories of humanity and ethics that have ever befallen man, not just through secular Marxism, but also through secular capitalism and globalism. Christianity absolutely has the winning case here, 100%. As it does through many of these narratives that we're going to go through here about this particular time in history. So anyways, guys, I really recommend you take your time and go through and go through it yourself. Like I said, all of this stuff is so very convoluted and tough to make sense of. Like, for example, I would want to say I side with somebody like William Jennings Bryan. It's tricky for me. I keep saying, I am Brian, right? My first name. This is William Jennings Bryan. So I would like to say I side with him, and I do on this particular issue. I think he was right. I do even side with him on some of his labor causes. At the same time, he's a teeter-toddler, right? He pushed the horrible legislation of prohibition. So he's not a man totally removed from the really horrible movements that were kind of happening in the early 20th century. But at the same time, as far as this story goes, as far as Scope's monkey trial goes, Brian's on the right side of history, and he's been maligned, and he's been undercut, and he's even lost some of that, as far as left ideology goes, he should be like kind of a darling for them, you know, like, but you can't. This is the thing about the left, right? You have to be 100% purist. If you fail on something like the Scopes monkey trial, then you're going to be, everything else you did is for naught. So again, it's a really convoluted thing. None of the characters, and I'm not even going to say, because there are, if you look into Darrow's life, the defense lawyer, he wasn't 100% behind the eugenics movement. He saw a lot of flaws with it. He did say some horrible things like in conjunction with it. But again, this is coming out of an era where social Darwinism is all the rage. You had men like Huxley and Malthus and some of these other like demographers who come up with these like theories about how we can, if you know anything about Darwinism, Darwinism is based on natural selection. Natural meaning that it's a process that takes place on its own without the intervention. Then there's this thing called artificial selection, right? And artificial selection, a good example of that is when human beings breed animals, right? When we breed dogs, for example, dog breeds, we're taking something that happens naturally and artificially, like, so if I want a dog that's a better swimmer, I take the best swimmers out of the litter and I breed with the other best swimmers, and then I keep breeding down the line until I come up with these very like keen swimming dogs, like the retrievers. So you're artificially selecting for certain traits. Well, the mind of the social Darwinist said, well, okay, well, we can, because they've got science behind them, right? And Darwin's correct, and all of the stuff that they're like propagating at the time. Well, they're saying, okay, well, why don't we just do that with humans? Because we are like 100% convinced here, and like the Germans who sort of take this up, right? You see a lot of your. It's an interesting thing. A lot of your like purebreds, Rottweiler, Doberman, the German Shepherd, a lot of these are like German breeds because the Germans were like super fascinated with eugenics and social Darwinism. But the Germans themselves picked it up from the American eugenics movement and the American social Darwinism and the English social the stuff that's coming out of England. So it wasn't like, yeah, we can like point fingers at the Germans and what they did, but it's born out of this like incestuous relation of all of these things. So they're at the time 1920s teaching that these, I should probably save this for the next lecture, but anyways, they're at the time teaching that these social, or excuse me, the artificial selection is the way forward, when in reality, as any of you that know anything about animals, purebred dogs are some of the most prone to illness and health issues, because when humans try to come in, this is one of the interesting things, right? And I think um this is like a sort of teleological uh let's say a teleological barrier that the Lord has put on us, where when we try to become too much in the likeness of God without first being sanctified, we're going to produce things that deteriorate and that fall apart, right? So we try to step in and say, oh, this is like the correct way to do things, when in fact, it if it's all void and bereft of a truly Christian moral ethical foundation, we actually just make a mess of things, because that's why some of these, like, you'll see it still exists in certain right-wing circles, and Twitter is such a like dumpster fire. You see it quite often, unfortunately, in Twitter, and even in some Catholic circles on Twitter on the right, where people are talking about like um kind of an ethnical cleansing and like race superiority and certain things like that that have been thoroughly debunked, at least thoroughly challenged, and the science does not lean in that general direction, because again, we know, like, for example, where we've tested it with things like animals. I don't get me wrong, I love certain period breeds. I love Dobermans, but Dobermans are prone to serious illnesses through the artificial selection, where man is trying to step in and say that we can control these things. And I like, again, I think the Lord is like, nope, that's the wrong telos. I created these species for a certain end, and you're not going to come step in and try to thwart that end. I'm going to make it fall apart. Anyways, guys, I'm going to try to get more into that next time. But for now, let's see. Are you from Jackson? Are you familiar with Paul Feyerabend's treatment of the Galileo affair? The monkey affair framing in popular media reminds me of the mainstream treatment of Galileo. Yeah, I'm a little bit so when you start getting into Galileo, you get more into what I've personally in my mind I start to refer to as modernity. I know quite a bit about the Galileo affair. I'm sorry, I haven't read that particular book, but I will say the way that the narrative has been presented and comes down, it does in some ways mimic what happens later with the Scopes Monkey trial. I do know that the purpose and the intent is to make the church look bad, specifically with Galileo, the Catholic Church. But I want to say, as far as popular historians today go, I feel like Stephen Weidenkopf, maybe somebody over at Catholic Answers who does some work on history, covered the Galileo affair not that long ago and did a pretty good treatment of it. But I agree 100% that there is definitely a similar impetus to control the narrative that only recently has the Galileo affair. And you still, on a popular level, you still see the Galileo affair presented as science versus religion, very much so. Where in the reality, it's way more complex than that. Even the great, one of my favorite of all the Jesuits, besides, I know Father John Brown watches my channel. You're probably the greatest living Jesuit, Father John Brown. We love the work that you do. Keep it up. My favorite of the great Saint Jesuits is Robert Bellarmine, and Bellarmine was involved in the Galileo affair. So let's see what you got here. Feyerabend, hopefully I'm saying his name there, argued that Galileo at the time lacked empirical and moral grounds for his claims. The issues get ignored later on by the scientific establishment to establish. Yes, well, yeah, and that's exactly kind of what they've done here. Though I would say the job with Galileo is a little bit more thoroughly ingrained because the Catholic movement is a worldwide movement, and it very much involves. Well, you know what? I'm going to say actually there it is kind of very much similar because I would say even though the Scopes Monkey trial is kind of isolated to an American context in the United States, it still actually is within this greater framework of what's happening in the 20th century. So I think there is worldwide implications for what's going to happen later, especially with the rise of the Nazi Party and even with the rise of what the Marxists end up doing in Russia and China. I think the Galileo affair is more ingrained in the world narrative of church science versus the church. But so in that sense, I think Galileo is more of a grander story as far as like world history goes. Scopes Monkey Trial is a little bit more of a like confined thing, but I do think it also has like worldwide implications where the secularists and their narrative of what they've been trying to push for at least the last 200 years since the French Revolution, if I'm honest, have been attempting to do. So, anyways, guys, if there's nothing else, we're coming up right about an hour. I appreciate everyone that's joined and watching. Hopefully, you've enjoyed this. Um, let's see, Jackson, one more time. The monkey trial definitely plays a large role in American atheist lore. Absolutely. And this is my little attempt to even just get that out there, right? I feel like some people are still embarrassed about the Scopes monkey trial when it comes to defending religion, and absolutely 100% we are on the right side of this. So if you do your homework and you know how they are presenting it versus how it actually happened, you will come out on the winning side on this. And if I'm wrong on that, you can come beat me up, but I know I'm not wrong on it. So 100% go for it, guys. All right. God bless you all, and I will see you next time.